Hello everyone, this is Dr. Chin, and this is your first lecture for tests and measurements for people who think they hate tests and measurements. So my hope for you in this course is that you come away with a better sense of appreciation for how tests and measurements are vital and important to our everyday types of activities because even before you realize it, you've been taking tests ever since you were born. The APGAR test, for example, immediately tests for your appearance, pulse, grimace, activity, respiration. So many other tests that we all go through developmentally wise that are designed to make sure you are a healthy and happy person. And so many other things that we do right now as well. Have you ever been to a mechanic who couldn't work on your car because he or she had no idea what is going on? The truth is, good interventions are always based on good assessments. And chances are, you're probably going to end up doing something in the future in your job that's going to need some type of assessment for you to get your job done or to figure out if you got your job done. Um, it's just like cooking, you gotta eat anyway, so why not learn how to cook? You gotta assess stuff every day anyway, so why not learn what goes into a good assessment? Um, so before I go into the material over here, just a quick tip. In these recorded lectures, I do highlight material that is likely to come up in your quizzes and quarterly assignments. So definitely pay close attention to what I'm emphasizing and not emphasizing in here. If you have other classmates who don't want to watch lectures, give them fair warning. They're probably going to miss out um, on the advantages that you get from watching these lectures. So your book actually does a nice job of summarizing the history of testing from pages 4 through 8, and this table over here is just a summary. Um, Testing in one form or another, it started a long time ago, almost about 3,000 years ago in China, and what they had was an open competitive job system that proved to be a model for later systems of evaluating and placing individuals um, in their respective jobs. So later civil service systems like in the U.S. and British civil system that all those started only much later on. I mean, we're talking about the difference between 3,000 years ago and about 100 plus years ago. Um, so yeah, that pretty much was the start of testing. Fast forward to a more modern era, Francis Galton over here. So, if you don't know, Francis Galton's cousin was Charles Darwin. Both of their work um, led to the modern era testing, arguably. So, Galton, for example, devised a set of tools for assessing individual differences such as height, weight, strength, and even how steady you can hold your hands. And he believed that these physical characteristics are related to intelligence. Once physical measurements were being made regularly, it wasn't long before other people, such as psychologist Dr. James Cattell, were working on the first mental test, and he was the one who coined the phrase mental test. And he's actually the founder of the Psychological Corporation in the early 1920s, now known as one of the leading publishers of tests in America. So if you don't believe me, just Google Psychological Corporation. You will see what I mean. Now fast forward to 1905. So 1905, Alfred Binet, he was then the minister of public instruction in Paris, and he started applying some of these new tools to the assessment of school children in Paris who were not performing as well as expected. The idea is that if we can identify these kids who would need more help, we can place them in appropriate classrooms to provide the proper scaffolding for those who need extra help and allow those who don't need extra help to get a similar type of challenge in the work that they do. So it's designed not to classify certain kids as being not smart or lost hopes, but basically to help identify kids who could use their extra help so we can level the playing field, so to speak, and help everyone get up to speed. Um, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon created the first test of intelligence. They used it with school children in that time, 1905. And then in 1916, Yarwood came to America thanks to Lewis Terman at Stanford, which is why one of the most commonly used modern intelligence tests is named the Stanford Binet. Just Google the Stanford Binet test. I believe we're in the 5th edition at this point. So, our roots actually don't go back that far. We can see a lot of the, historical artifacts in the modern renditions of intelligence testing instruments that we have nowadays. The Wechsler-Bellevue Intelligence Scale. Now we have, I think we're in the 5th edition, and actually maybe for the Stanford Binet, we may be in the 6th edition. I need to double check that. But the Wechsler scales really was the first scale that was successful in being able to measure intelligence, not just for kids, but to adults. The problem was that the way in which intelligence was measured in kids was based on the idea of mental years and actual physical years, and that works pretty well with kids. So the difference of intelligence between, say, a 5-year-old kid and a 7-year-old kid, you would see quite some big differences in terms of their cognitive developments, but the difference between a 35-year-old adult and a 37-year-old adult, those comparisons start to break down because you don't expect to see that much of a difference. But it was David Wechsler who came up with a scoring system that was based on statistical theory that enabled us to still make valid comparisons to better interpret what certain scores mean. So what does it mean to get a raw score of 10 out of 15 points on a particular scale? We need to compare your score to other similar people from the population that you belong to figure out where you place in that entire distribution. So more about all this when we start talking about validity in later chapters. But these are just some of the highlights of notable historical occurrences. And a bunch of other things happened as well in the history of testing. I'm not going to focus too much on these things right here, but you're definitely welcome to learn more about these historical happenings. Really interesting stuff, especially when it comes to seeing how these things apply to the way in which we organize ourselves and run society in this day and age. Donald's Supersterior Career Development and John Holland's Classification System of Careers. These are the two big names in vocational testing, so career testing basically. And for this class, we'll cover mostly Holland's Classification System of Careers in Chapter 18. Alright, here are some pictures of these very handsome people. Considered the founding fathers of testing. So we talked about Charles Darwin already and how his work in evolution led to an increased interest and emphasis on individual differences, and that's essentially what most tests examine: individual differences. His cousin Francis Galton, the lesser famous person but still pretty famous in the field of testing, he was the first person to devise a set of tools to assess individual differences on those physical characteristics that I just talked about. I believe one of the things that he actually measured was how strong your sucker punch was, and other types of esoteric features. I mean, his motto was wherever you can, you count, and so he in his lab he would measure all those things. Then soon after, we had James Cattell, who coined the phrase mental test and who arguably made the first mental test. And then Theodore Simon and Alfred Binet. These two individuals are the dynamic duo who used intelligence testing to help Parisian school children, and later on beyond just their school children's abilities, because their good friend here, Lewis Terman from Stanford University, didn't want to be left out of the party and help them extend their work to America in 1916. That's why the Stanford Binet test is arguably one of the most popular intelligence tests that we have in this country at this point. Last but not least, we have Stanley Kaplan. This is the businessman who created an empire of test centers that are supposed to help people raise their score through instructions. Some people agree or disagree that you are able to do that. Just Google Kaplan. You'll see a bunch of different books. You probably used one of his materials before if you've ever needed to study for the SATs or GREs or ACTs. Actually use it to study, I believe, for the SATs and GREs. Not bad for test materials, but I also use other types of things to help me study too. So these are the famous people right here, the founding fathers of testing, so to speak. So, let's go to the next slide. What is a test? We're going to define a test as a tool, procedure, device, examination, investigation, assessment of an outcome. It can take the form of most of anything that you can replicate reliably and do so in a valid way. So it can come in the form of a 50 multiple choice question, a 30-minute interview, a set of tasks that examine how good you are at fitting together blocks in a particular design, or whether or not you prefer multi-grain Cheerios or plain Cheerios. These are just some random examples from a textbook over here. So really, a test is a tool or procedure that can measure an outcome that is of interest to you. So really, this is the reason why I say when it comes to assessments, we rely on these assessments pretty much most of the day, every day. Just looking at your fuel gauge was another way of assessing how much fuel you have in your car. Alright, so here's a quick review of some of the content areas that the test covers. Let me just make sure that I'm actually recording. I'm actually recording. Okay, for a moment there I was like, am I actually recording? Alright, so here's a quick review of the content areas that test covers. Achievement, personality, aptitude, ability or intelligence, neuropsych, vocational or career testing. Most of every test that we have, especially in the social behavioral sciences, are going to fall into one of these categories. And after we talk about what we test, we're going to talk about why we test. And I want you to be able to make that clear distinction between the types of categories of tests that we have, so what we test, and the purpose of different types of tests. That is the why we test, because in your quizzes there are definitely going to be questions that are going to require you to distinguish between the categories of tests that we have and the reasons why we use those tests, because sometimes we may use tests that may fall under one category but for a different purpose. Alright, another thing that may be relevant to your assignment, so knowing the types of tests is going to be useful for your first quarterly assignment. You have 5 journal articles that I've uploaded in Moodle. I want you to read them, identify the variables that have been tested in each of those articles, what test was used to test it, what type of test was it, and this is where this material over here in this slide becomes relevant for that. Okay, so achievement tests. Achievement tests basically assess an individual's level of knowledge in a particular domain. So here are a number of examples in here. Taking a midterm in a history class, there will be one type of achievement test. So it's basically just measuring how much knowledge you have in a particular domain. Personality tests. This assesses an individual's unique and stable set of characteristics, traits, or attitudes. So a measure that assesses introversion and extroversion, for example. Unfortunately for this class, we won't have time to delve into this, but if you are interested in this, feel free to contact me, because due to the student learning outcomes, for this course, you need to focus on how to build a test and intelligence testing. So I'll mention about personality testing, but we won't have time to go too much into this. But definitely for the quizzes, you definitely want to know what the difference is between an achievement test and a personality test and an aptitude test. So what is an aptitude test? An aptitude test measures an individual's potential to succeed in an activity requiring a particular set of skills or a skill. So maybe it's a test that measures your potential for being a successful salesperson. These are tests that help predict your potential to succeed in a particular type of skill. Alright, ability or intelligence tests, and we will cover this more in depth in chapter 17. This assesses your level of skill or competence in a wide variety of areas. The Wechslers, the Stanford-Binet, those are the really famous ones like mentioned before. Don't know why we have performance tests in here. I'm gonna remove this from your slides because I think the newer version of your test. Let me check this real quick. Chapter 17. It does have performance. I'm not going to ask you what a performance test is. I think that's kind of splitting hairs a little bit. So let's move on to vocational or career. These are tests that are designed to measure your interests and to help classify those interests as they relate to particular jobs or careers. So a vocational test that evaluates your level of interest in the culinary arts or the healthcare professions, for example. In the neuropsych test, these are tests that assess the functioning of the brain as it relates to everyday activities such as emotions, thinking, orientation to person, place, and time. Those kinds of things that measure different cognitive abilities that map onto specific physiological correlates in your brain. Alright, so these are the what we test, the types of categories. You definitely want to memorize this so that when you take the quiz, you don't need to be flipping through the pages to try to find out the answers. Remember, you have less than 5 minutes, I think, to do the quiz. So study this, memorize this, try to connect these categories to tests that you may have taken before in your own life. That might help with your memory. Alright, so we talked about the different categories of tests that we have. I want to talk about the different purposes of why we have different types of tests. So, selection tests. So selection tests are those tests that determine if someone can take on a certain vocation so that only those who score at a certain level of performance on an assessment will be selected for training. So only certain people, for example, can be a jet pilot. Only certain people can be a medical doctor. Only certain people can be a psychologist. So these are tests that help determine whether or not you can or you are allowed to take on a certain vocation. These are tests that are designed to help gatekeep a certain profession, to help protect the public at large. Placement tests. The placement tests are used to determine where an individual belongs, such as if you're entering into college or if you're starting grade 1, for example. So not everyone should be in the most advanced math class or in the most basic class, right? Arguably, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon created their intelligence test to help place kids into classes that would best meet their needs according to what they're able or not able to do. Diagnoses. This is another reason why some people administer tests. Typically used in the realm of the clinical settings. These tests are used to identify individuals who might report a set of symptoms that meet criteria for a category of the disorder or categories of disorders. A doctor, for example, may administer a test or a group of tests to help diagnose any one of the many different mental health disorders, for instance. Hypothesis testing is another reason why we administer tests. So essentially to test a hypothetical statement. So for example, if children getting extra reading help throughout the week, they will score better on the reading test of comprehension than compared to kids who don't get the extra help. A very important part of testing this question is using a test that measures reading comprehension accurately. If we don't have a measure that is able to measure reading comprehension, we are not able to test this hypothetical statement of whether extra reading help throughout the week will help them score better on the reading test. So sometimes we administer tests to help us test hypotheses. Last but not least is to classify. So if you want to know what profession might suit you best, so as opposed to selection, this is more so to help assess your aptitude or future potential in a career. So it's not really hard and fast like selection, but this gives you an idea about what professions might suit you best. So be sure you know the distinction between selection and classification. And I think that's it in regards to why we test. So remember, definitely memorize and study this and know the difference between the types of categories of tests that we have. So what we test versus why we test. So the purpose of why we test. A couple of important reminders here about assessment. Some behaviors are going to be easier to measure than others. So measuring your ability to, say, solve 5 plus 1 is going to be way easier to assess compared to how you solve a quadratic equation. But therein lies the challenge, and some people really do like the challenge of making measures that assess for constructs that may not be readily accessible through common sense types of ways. Our understanding of behavior is only as good as the tools that we use to measure it. There are all kinds of ways that we can try to measure outcomes. Let's take anxiety for example. We can measure it through self-report, through a clinical interview, through a measure of your heart rate variability, through a measure of which parts of your brain light up when you are anxious. Sometimes you use the very best instruments available, and then at other times we may just need to use what is convenient and what is realistic. In clinical settings, a lot of times you see this tension of what resources you do have to be able to use to measure certain things and what you're trying to measure. We cannot, unfortunately, we are not able to use the most ideal measures in every situation. Another quick note about this is, just because something is physiological doesn't mean it's good. So a measure of, say, your generalized anxiety disorder symptoms, right? Just because you get a measure of someone's, say, heart rate, doesn't mean that's going to be a better measure of their GAD symptoms compared to, say, a self-report measure or a clinical interview. In fact, measuring your heart rate to get a sense of GAD symptoms is probably a worse way of doing that compared to other types of ways. So just because something seems like it's biological doesn't mean it's a good way to measure. There's a lot of noise that you can incur in those types of measurements as well. Tests and measurement tools can take on many different forms: paper and pencil, self-report, observations, performance. When I was an undergrad, part of my job in a research lab was to go into Head Start centers and take frequency counts of specific behaviors that would define a priority to measure the effectiveness of a teaching intervention on kids. So in addition to that, we also had self-report measures. We had other informant measures of anxiety, depression, conduct issues. So tests and measurements can take on many different forms. Doesn't always mean a paper and pencil type of thing. Now, the results from any test should always be interpreted within the context in which they occur. So, for example, is English literally the person's first language? If a person is completing a self-report measure, what is the person's reading level? Can this person actually understand the instructions and read the items? If Tommy gets a score of 10 out of 15 on a score of, say, anxiety, what does that even mean? Is it high or low? And if it is high or low, what are we comparing that against? We always want to compare our scores, or we always want to interpret our scores within the context in which they're collected. So there's definitely going to be some common sense in interpreting what certain scores mean. Um, we'll talk about norms and all that in later chapters as well. Having that benchmark to know what we are comparing our scores against is always going to be an issue that will come up again and again, especially in countries where we don't have standardized scores yet for lots of different measurements and tests. Um, we're pretty fortunate to be living in the United States, whereby a lot of tests are actually standardized within the population here. Right. Related to that, test results can be misused. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to be aware of all the different controversies that have happened over how tests are used. In the 1930s, for example, many non-English speaking immigrants were turned away based on their test score that probably was not very valid at all in terms of measuring their intelligence. The Nazis themselves created their own intelligence tests and used them for their own nefarious means. A bunch of people in California, mostly poor women, low SES, poor women in California, who were sterilized because they were considered inferior based on some intelligence tests that they were taking. So, test results can be misused, and we gotta be really careful. So it's almost like that cliched saying from that old Spider-Man movie: with great power comes great responsibility. Part of this course is to teach you what your test can and cannot measure, and to use it for in ways that will help improve the betterment of well-being for everyone, not just selected people. Many tests, especially achievement tests, have a goal of distinguishing between those who know the material and those who do not. This is especially applicable for achievement types of testing. So that's a given. I think that's just a reminder from your textbook authors there. All right. Up until now, the development of most tests fall within two realms, or two family of statistical theory: classical test theory and item response theory. The older one is consistent with its name, is classical test theory, or CTT. Now, CTT primarily looks to increase the accuracy of predicting a test taker's true score or the actual value of a trait, characteristic, level of knowledge, or any other domain. So as we'll see, true scores are theoretical in nature because it would be quite impossible to rule out all sources of error in test taking and get a 100% accurate true score, but we can estimate pretty well how much error. There could be random error or systematic error that is contributing to an individual final score. And so if we can parse out that estimated error, we can get a pretty good estimate of the person's true score on a particular test. We won't be going into too much. We'll touch upon this, especially when we talk about reliability. But if you want to know more about this, you probably need to take more advanced courses in psychological testing, such as the graduate course that I'm teaching in psychometrics. Alright, at least one alternative to CTT, which is a more modern one, is IRT, which places the emphasis not on an individual's performance, but on the items themselves and how item difficulty is not a constant but can change. So more about this in chapter 6. That's a quick teaser for you about what IRT is. All right. So how do I develop a test? Now, test construction is a very detailed and intricate process. The entire process is pretty linear, such that step 2 always follows step 1 and step 3 follows step 2, but within each step there is always some evaluation of whether it's time to move on to the next step. For the purposes of the quiz or the quizzes, you definitely want to know which steps come first. So you know, for example, if the final determination of items, does that happen after or before pilot testing, or when do you establish reliability and validity? When do you actually develop the norms? So having a decent idea about the sequence of these steps will be helpful for you, not just for the test, but in terms of conceptualizing, in case if you need to make your own test in the future. For one, you definitely need to take a more advanced course rather than this, but you at least have a basic idea about the various steps that you need to do in order to make this possible. Alright, so what am I doing here in this class? Looks great in the transcript. Having these skills and understanding is definitely a big plus. If this is not a required course, taking a basic test and measurement course may set you apart from those who don't. It shows that you are willing to take a course that is above average in regards to difficulty and commitment. Basic information about tests and measurement is an intellectual challenge of a kind that you might not be used to. So just kind of keep in mind that a good deal of thinking is required, as well as some integration of ideas and applications across the chapters. Bottom line is, this can be a pretty fun and invigorating intellectual experience, and I'm hoping this will be that for you. This course can make you a better student in the social and behavioral sciences. Once you've mastered this material, you will have a better understanding of what you're reading in journals or what your professors or colleagues may be discussing about. If you plan to pursue a graduate degree in one of the many social, behavioral, and health sciences fields, this course will give you a solid foundation on what you need to move further. Bragging rights, yeah, sure, but quite honestly, you probably need to take a more advanced course before you can start having some bragging rights. But I would say this course gives you a good foundation to understand what is assessment and why assessment is so important. Sometimes when I read this textbook, it does sound a little bit condescending. I'm sure you guys know that you're not dumb. So I'm just gonna highlight some helpful hints here for you. Is this course hard? My recommendation is that you start this course with an attitude, with an open mind. Just wait and see. Judge this experience for yourself. I've tried to make some videos and make the instructions as clear as possible and the grading rubrics as clear as possible to help maximize your chance of being successful in this course. You can form a study group if you want, although that may be difficult since you all are online students. You could definitely, if you're interested, there are some online forum features that we could use. So feel free to contact me if you have ideas about ways in which you want to reach out to other students here in this class. Ask questions, definitely ask me if you don't understand anything. I'm here to help. Do the exercises. The exercises at the end of the chapters are going to be really useful. In fact, some of the quarterly assignments are revisions or just different ways, different modifications of the practice questions at the end of the chapter. So practice, look for real life applications, in your other classes. So other classes that you're taking other than this, you may have the occasion to read journal articles, to talk about the results of your research, and generally discuss the importance of the scientific method in your area of study. All these are just opportunities to look to see how your study of tests and measurements can help you better understand the topics under those classroom discussions, as well as any area of beginning statistics, because we will be talking about some statistics here in this course as well. Not a whole lot, but just some, just enough for you to be dangerous. Browse. You want to read the assigned chapter first, go back and read it more with intention. A quick tip for you is at the headings for each section in your chapter. When you read those headings, turn those headings into questions. So on page 13, for example, there's a heading that says how tests are created, and then it shows you all the steps. So change that heading into a question. So how are tests created? And as you're reading the section that follows that, find the answer to that question. That will help you to be more active in finding something in the sea of words that's in your textbook over here compared to just glazing over it. So first round, just briefly read through the main topics, have a general sense of how in-depth or how comprehensive a certain chapter is. Have a bird's eye view basically, and then go back and read it again, and this time transform the chapter headings into questions and read it with more intention in finding the answers to those questions. And that will help you not fall asleep when you're reading through the chapter. Not that the topic is boring, but this is just applicable to any types of academic reading, I find. All right, have fun. It really all boils down to you mastering this topic rather than letting the course and its demands master you. Set up a study schedule and follow this. Consider this as an exercise for growth. Mastering new material or skills is always exciting and satisfying if we can somehow make it see the connections to how this is personally relevant to you. Do that, and that's about half the challenge already. And hopefully the enthusiasm will be more intrinsic and will come from within. Last but not least, be easy on yourself. Keep in mind that this is not material that any introductory student masters in a matter of hours or days. It takes some thinking, some hard work. So set your expectations to be realistic, and just go from there. So that's really all I have for you in this first chapter here. Definitely, since this is your first week in class as well, read through the syllabus. I try to lay things out as cleanly and as clearly as possible. Do the quizzes, open up the quarterly assignments, look through all the resources that I'm providing to you. My recommendation is to carve out time to basically complete part of the quarterly assignment each week as you're going through the week. So basically you have a quarterly assignment every about 4 weeks. So get it done while the information is still fresh. It'll help streamline the process of getting your assignments done, and it will also help with retention as well, especially once you start integrating information across chapters as we go through the book. That's all I have for you guys for chapter 1. Have fun with this. Looking forward to a great semester, and let me know if you have questions.